When the studio lights dimmed during Johnny Carson's final weeks, no one imagined that a single whispered secret from Elizabeth Taylor would shatter the most controlled man in television history. It was February 21st, 1992, and the air in Studio One felt heavy with the weight of an impending goodbye, a historical conclusion that felt almost too large for the small screen to contain. Johnny was a man who had spent 30 long years perfecting the art of the mask, the cool, detached, and witty persona that had become a nightly comfort for an entire nation. But tonight, that mask was about to be ripped away by a woman who knew his soul better than he knew his own, revealing a vulnerability he had spent a lifetime trying to bury beneath the floorboards of his success. You see, everyone thought they knew the king of late night, but there was a darkness he had hidden since he first stepped foot in Hollywood, a darkness that was about to come to light in the most public way possible. The audience of 300 people rose instantly to their feet as the violet-eyed legend stepped through the curtain and into the spotlight. The applause was a deafening roar, a tidal wave of affection for a woman who had survived everything Hollywood could throw at her, from the crushing weight of child stardom to the blinding glare of constant tabloid scrutiny. But as Elizabeth Taylor's eyes met Johnny's across the desk, something shifted that no one in the room could explain. A momentary pause in the universe where the scripted world of television collided with the unscripted reality of human connection. Johnny Carson, the man who had hosted 4,531 episodes with unflappable grace, stood frozen behind his desk, his usual professional polish replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated shock. Because what he had just been told backstage 30 seconds before the cameras rolled was something he was never supposed to hear, let alone acknowledge in front of 40 million Americans. But what happened next shocked everyone. 5 minutes in the dark behind the scenes at NBC Studios in Burbank, the atmosphere at 4:47 inches the afternoon was thick with tension and the scent of fresh flowers and hairspray. Johnny Carson had only 13 days left before he would walk away from the throne he had occupied for 3 decades, a transition that felt like the end of an era for millions of viewers. He was sitting alone in his dressing room on the 3rd floor of Studio One, staring at a note card covered in blue ink, preparing for the most anticipated interview of his final run. Elizabeth Taylor did not grant many interviews, and she had never appeared on The Tonight Show in its current form, making this more than just a segment. It was a cultural event.
Before we continue our video, I'd like to say something. I often see comments from people who didn't realize they weren't subscribed. If you enjoy the channel, please take a second to check and make sure you're subscribed. It's free, and it really helps us keep the show growing. Thank you for being part of this journey with us.
It was supposed to be a celebration of two icons, a victory lap for a career well spent and a life lived in the public eye. But then, his executive producer Fred de Cordova knocked twice and walked in with a look of genuine concern that immediately put Johnny on edge. "She's here," Fred said, his voice unusually tight, as if he were carrying a secret of his own. Johnny looked up from his notes, expecting the usual pre-show pleasantries, or perhaps a request for a specific lighting adjustment. But Fred wasn't finished. "She's asking for 5 minutes with you alone. No producers, no cameras, just you." In 30 years of broadcasting, Johnny had never had a guest request a private meeting like this. Not presidents, not kings, not the greatest legends of cinema or the most volatile of rock stars. He set down his note card, his heart beginning to race with a feeling of anticipation he hadn't felt in years, a sense that the ground was shifting beneath his feet. "Tell her yes," he replied quietly, unaware that those 5 minutes would change his life forever and force him to confront a ghost from his past. And this is exactly where everything changed. The ghost of 1952. When Johnny finally emerged from that dressing room and walked toward the stage, he looked like a different man, a man who had just seen a ghost or discovered a hidden treasure. His face had gone pale, his hands were strangely still, and the note card with all his prepared questions had been left behind, forgotten on his dressing room desk. He was walking into a live broadcast in front of 40 million Americans without a single prepared word, relying entirely on instinct and the raw emotion of the moment. The staff watched in a stunned silence, sensing that the history they thought they knew was about to be rewritten by the woman waiting behind the curtain. To understand why this night was different, you have to understand what Elizabeth Taylor had been carrying in silence for 40 years. She was 60 years old, a survivor of 8 marriages, 2 Academy Awards, and more scandals than most could count, yet she remained the most photographed woman in the world. But beneath the diamonds and the famous violet eyes was a woman who kept a small photograph in her Bible that she had never shown to a single journalist or biographer. It was a photograph from 1952, taken in a studio commissary in Culver City during a small gathering that most had long since forgotten. In it were 3 young people, including a 20-year-old television host from Nebraska who had arrived in Los Angeles with only $50 in his pocket and a dream that felt almost impossible. His name was Johnny Carson, and Elizabeth Taylor had been there the night everything almost ended before it even began. A night where 2 young dreamers stood on the edge of giving up. You have not seen the biggest surprise yet, because Elizabeth hadn't come to the show to talk about her movies or her jewelry. She had come to confess a secret that would rock Johnny Carson to his very foundation. The breaking of a king as. The show began at 5:30 p.m. Johnny went through the motions of his monologue with a mechanical precision that only 30 years of experience could provide. He joked about the upcoming presidential election and the Grammy Awards, and the audience laughed on cue, but the stage manager noticed something terrifying. Between the jokes, Johnny kept glancing at the curtain with an expression of both desperate longing and intense fear, as if he were waiting for a storm to break. He was like a man waiting for a reckoning that he had spent his entire adult life trying to outrun, a moment of truth that could no longer be delayed. When Ed McMahon finally introduced Elizabeth Taylor, the studio erupted in a sound that was more than just applause. It was an acknowledgement of greatness. It was the sound of 300 people realizing they were witnessing something rare, sacred, and entirely irreplaceable. Elizabeth Taylor walked out in a deep burgundy dress, her dark hair swept back, looking directly at Johnny with an expression of raw relief that bypassed all professional etiquette. For the first 12 minutes, they played the expected game, talking about her advocacy work for AIDS research and the foundation she had built with such passion. She was sharp and funny, but there was an invisible current running beneath the conversation that both could feel, a tension that the cameras were catching without understanding. Then, Johnny did something he never did in 4,000 episodes. He set down his remaining cards, leaned forward, and asked a question that stripped away the professional distance between the host and the legend. "What saved you?" he asked, his voice quiet, personal, and stripped of all its late-night artifice. What keeps a person going when everything is falling apart? The studio went deathly quiet as Elizabeth Taylor looked at her hands and then back at the man she had met in a different world 40 years prior. "There was a night," she began, her voice slower and softer, stripped of the performance that had defined her public persona for decades. "A long time ago, when I was 20 and I was completely falling apart inside, despite what the magazines said." She described a gathering in 1952 where she sat next to a thin, nervous young man who was trying to hide his terror with too many jokes. He was a man from a small town in Nebraska who was sitting in that commissary convinced he had made a terrible mistake. And in that moment, Johnny Carson's face went completely still as he realized she was talking about a version of himself he thought he had buried. The words that saved a soul wait, do not miss this detail. They had sat together for 3 hours that night, talking about the difference between being famous and being known by another human soul. They had talked about the weight of it all, and how they both had considered putting it all down and disappearing into the night, never to be seen again. And then she repeated the words he had said to her that night, the words that had kept her alive through the darkest periods of her legendary life. "I think the only reason to keep going is this. If we stop, The people who come after us won't know it's survivable." She looked him in the eye and said, "That was you, Johnny." And the world seemed to stop spinning for everyone in the studio. On live television, a silence of 8 seconds followed an eternity in the fast-paced world of broadcasting, where every second is calculated for profit. Johnny sat perfectly still, his hands flat on the desk, before slowly shaking his head in a state of profound disbelief. "I had $40 left," he whispered, his professional voice gone, replaced by the raw vulnerability of that 26-year-old kid from Nebraska. "I was going to call the airline that night and tell my father he was right, that I was a failure, and I was coming home." The audience wasn't just watching a talk show anymore. They were witnessing a profound human moment that defied the limits of the medium. Two legends who had unknowingly saved each other's lives were finally standing in the light together, sharing a truth kept for 40 years. Then came the moment that television historians would study frame by frame for decades to come. Johnny Carson, the most controlled and private man in the history of American entertainment, pressed his hands against his desk, lowered his head, and began to cry. This wasn't a performance for the ratings. It was real grief and real relief pouring out of a man who had held it all in for 30 years of nightly performance. Elizabeth Taylor didn't hesitate. She rose from her chair, walked to his desk, and put her hand over his in a gesture of pure companionship. "Look at me," she said gently, her own eyes filled with tears. "We made it. Both of us. We made it," she whispered, as the studio audience rose as one in a spontaneous act of reverence. A truth for millions. But what happened next shocked everyone in the control booth and the 40 million people watching from their living rooms. Elizabeth Taylor turned to the camera and addressed the nation directly, her presence filling every corner of the screen. She told them that they were wrong if they thought the burdens they carried in the dark were theirs alone to bear. She told them that the person next to them, whether on a bus or in a hospital, was likely carrying something just as heavy as their own struggles. "I am standing here because I believed him," she said, pointing to the man who had unknowingly given her the strength to continue. It was a message of hope that resonated far beyond the studio walls, reaching into the lonely hearts of millions of viewers. Johnny asked her one last question, his voice still thick with emotion. "What do you need people to understand about you that they don't?" Elizabeth was quiet for a long moment before answering with a clarity that silenced the entire room. "I need them to know that I am not brave," she said, shattering the myth of her own invincibility. She explained that keeping going isn't the same as being unafraid, and that she had lived with fear every single day of her adult life. But she had learned that fear doesn't have to be the final word, and that survival is a choice we make together. As the cameras finally stopped rolling, the studio fell into a reverent silence that no one wanted to break. The unending echo, the legacy of that night, was immense and immediate, changing the way America thought about its icons. NBC's switchboard was overwhelmed by thousands of callers who had been reached by their unprecedented honesty and vulnerability. Mental health organizations reported an unprecedented volume of calls from people who finally felt they had permission to speak their own hidden truths. Even a 72-year-old woman from Omaha wrote to Johnny, thanking him for words he had spoken in 1952 that had helped her survive her own dark place. Johnny retired 3 months later, but he carried the peace of that February night with him into his long and private retirement. Every year on February 21st, he would place a private phone call to Elizabeth Taylor, a silent acknowledgement of the night they saved each other. In Elizabeth Taylor's personal effects after her death in 2011, her family found a simple, worn note card. On it, in her own handwriting, were those 3 powerful words that had changed everything. "It is survivable." Below them, she had written, "He was right," and the date, February 21st. 1992, marking the night the secret was finally shared. It was the final proof that a single conversation, born of desperation and honesty, can echo across decades and save a life many times over. Somewhere right now, Someone is deciding whether to stay or to go. And perhaps these words will be the reason they choose to stay another night. Because as Johnny and Elizabeth proved, the most extraordinary truth is that we are never as alone as we feel. Like, subscribe, and tell us where you are watching from tonight so we can see how far this story travels. This story of Johnny Carson and Elizabeth Taylor is a reminder that our words have power we may never fully understand at the time. Did you ever say something to a stranger that you forgot immediately, but it changed their life in a way you'll never know? Or has a passing comment from someone else stayed with you for years, giving you strength when you needed it most? Let us know in the comments below and help us keep these stories of courage and connection alive for those who need them. Thank you for being part of this journey with us. And remember, no matter how dark the room gets, it is always survivable. In 1952, Los Angeles was a city of blinding sun and even more blinding ambition, a place where thousands of young people arrived every week, dreaming of a life they had only seen on the silver screen. Among them was a 26-year-old Johnny Carson, a man whose Nebraska roots felt like an anchor pulling him back toward a safe, predictable life he couldn't bring himself to accept. He had arrived in the city with only $50 in his wallet and a second-hand car that barely made it over the mountain passes. Every night, he sat in his small, rented room, listening to the sounds of a city that didn't know he existed, wondering if he was just another fool who had traded security for a fantasy. The humidity of that summer seemed to cling to his skin like the doubt that clouded his mind. He was a man of immense talent, but talent alone doesn't pay the rent or quiet the voice in your head that tells you you're a fraud. This was the Johnny Carson that Elizabeth Taylor met, not the icon, not the king, but a desperate young man with his hand on a telephone, ready to call home and admit defeat. By 1992, Elizabeth Taylor was a living testament to the resilience of the human spirit, a woman who had been through the fire and emerged with her soul intact. She had survived a near-fatal bout of pneumonia in 1961 that required an emergency tracheotomy and left the world believing they were about to lose her. She had survived spinal surgeries that would have left others bedridden, and she had navigated the treacherous waters of addiction with a public dignity that few could match. But it was her work in the 1980s that truly defined her later years. At a time when the world turned its back on those suffering from AIDS, Elizabeth Taylor stood up and became their voice. She had watched her dear friend Rock Hudson wither away, and she had decided that she would not let a generation disappear in silence. This was the woman who walked onto Johnny's stage, a warrior who knew that the only way to survive the dark was to bring others into the light with you. The final 13 days of The Tonight Show were a period of bittersweet reflection for everyone involved in the production. At NBC's Studio One, the hallways were lined with flowers and telegrams from around the world, and the air was filled with a sense of reverence that made even the most seasoned crew members speak in hushed tones. Johnny himself seemed more introspective, spending longer periods alone in his dressing room, perhaps contemplating the legacy he was leaving behind after 3 decades of nightly service. He had seen the world change from the black and white era of the early 60s to the high-definition reality of the 90s, and he had been the one constant in the lives of millions. Yet even with all that success, there was a part of him that still felt like that kid from Nebraska, unsure if he had truly made a difference. That was the man Elizabeth Taylor came to see, a man who needed to know that his life had mattered in ways he couldn't possibly imagine. The February 21st, 1992 episode of The Tonight Show has since become a cornerstone of television history, studied by students and scholars alike for its raw emotional honesty. It is often cited as the moment when the art of the celebrity interview was transformed into something deeper, a genuine human conversation. In a medium often criticized for its superficiality, Johnny and Elizabeth provided a glimpse into the profound connections that can exist beneath the surface of fame. The episode is preserved in the Paley Center for Media and continues to be a source of inspiration for those who believe in the power of truth-telling. Therapists have even used the footage to demonstrate the healing power of shared vulnerability and the importance of acknowledging one's struggles. It remains a testament to the fact that even in the most public of settings, The most important moments are the ones where we truly see each other. Johnny Carson's legacy is not just one of jokes and monologues, but of moments like these, where he allowed the world to see the man behind the desk. The world of 1952 was a starkly different place, yet the human heart remained the same landscape of hope and terror. For Elizabeth, she was already a star of massive proportions, having transitioned from the innocent charm of National Velvet to the sophisticated allure of the Hollywood elite. But fame was a cage, and the bars were made of the expectations of a public that only saw the surface. She was a young woman grappling with the concept of herself as a commodity, a beautiful object to be bought, sold, and traded by studio executives. The commissary at Culver City was the epicenter of this gilded cage, a place where the powerful rubbed shoulders with the hopeful and where the air was thick with the smoke of 1,000 cigarettes and the heavy scent of expensive perfume. It was here, in a corner obscured by the shadows of more famous faces, that she saw the young man from Nebraska. He wasn't the polished host of the NBC era. He was a wire-thin youth with eyes that darted around the room like a trapped animal's, his hands twitching as he reached for a drink he didn't really want. His jokes were loud and frequent, but they didn't reach his eyes, which were clouded with a sadness that mirrored her own. They were two satellites orbiting a planet of superficiality, and for one brief night their paths crossed. They spoke of the loneliness that comes from being surrounded by people who only want a piece of you, never a part of you. They spoke of the cold fear that strikes at 3 a.m, the whisper that says you aren't enough and you never will be. It was in that shared darkness that the spark of connection was ignited, a spark that would lay dormant for 40 years before exploding into the light on national television. The studio environment of the 1990s was the peak of the broadcast era, a time before the internet would fragment the collective experience of the nation. When Johnny Carson spoke, the country listened. His desk was the most important piece of real estate in Hollywood, a mahogany platform that had seen the rise and fall of countless careers. The lights above were hot and blinding, creating a world where only the center of the stage felt real, while everything else faded into the dark. On that February night, the usual rhythm of the show, the familiar, "Here's Johnny," the swing of the golf club, the banter with Ed, felt like a ritual that was finally reaching its ultimate purpose. The orchestra, led by Doc Severinsen, played with a warmth that felt like a protective embrace, grounding the stars in a sea of sound. Every camera angle was a calculated choice. Every movement by the crew was a practiced dance. But no amount of preparation could have braced them for the raw humanity that was about to unfold. This was the moment where the artificiality of the television studio was pierced by the needle of truth, and for once, everyone in the building was truly present, their own lives and struggles forgotten as they witnessed the unfolding of a 40-year-old mystery that had finally found its resolution in the most unlikely of places. The impact of the February 21st broadcast was not merely felt in the ratings, which were among the highest of Johnny's final season, but in the very fabric of American culture. In the days following the show, newspaper editorials from coast to coast reflected on the profound vulnerability shown by two of the nation's most guarded icons. Critics who had spent years dissecting Johnny's ice-cold professional exterior were forced to reevaluate the man who had occupied their living rooms for 3 decades. They saw that his detachment was not a lack of feeling, but a shield, a way to survive the crushing weight of public expectation. Similarly, the public's perception of Elizabeth Taylor shifted from that of a tragic, glamorous legend to that of a deeply empathetic human being who had used her own pain to light the way for others. The letters that flooded into NBC were not the typical fan mail asking for autographs. They were confessions. People wrote about their own 1,952 moments, the nights they had spent staring at a telephone or a bottle of pills, wondering if life was worth the effort. They wrote about the strangers who had unknowingly saved them with a kind word or a shared laugh. One letter, from a veteran of the Korean War, described how he had sat in his dark apartment in Chicago, feeling like a ghost in his own life, until he heard Johnny and Elizabeth's story. He wrote that for the first time since returning home, he felt that his own struggle was survivable. These letters were organized by Johnny's staff into thick binders that he reportedly kept in his home library, a private testament to the fact that his career was about more than just entertainment. It was about the irreplaceable power of human connection across the boundaries of fame and time.